It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Rabbi Davis and the folks here at Beth El. I want to thank University of Minnesota and Leslie Morris for the Center for Jewish Studies for making this happen, and then Ron for being willing to lie in public. So, okay, but it's wonderful. So. The book has kind of odd origins, and I guess it's appropriate that I begin with a personal story, since he says this is personal, because in fact, I guess it is, because it began back several years ago when I was involved with driving my children and my neighbors' children to Hebrew school at Temple, Israel, on a regular basis, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, and I would make that drive from Golden Valley, where we live, just about a mile north of here, and I'd make that drive, and it was a little bit tyrannous, and I was in the midst of actually writing this book that Ron mentioned on humanitarianism, and I'm driving the carpool, I'm driving up to the doorway, and I noticed that the banner that had been fixed above for a long time at the temple, which said something to the effect of "We support Israel in its fight and struggle for peace and security," had been taken down, and in its place had been put up this new banner that said "Save Darfur." And that struck me as a little bit curious or odd. And part of the reason was I've been doing a lot of work on humanitarianism. If you really want to understand humanitarianism, you got to actually be willing to engage in faith, and because so much of humanitarianism is really about religious convictions and commitment. And this seemed to be maybe an expression of Jewish humanitarianism. And I hadn't really thought much about Jewish humanitarianism. I'd spent most of my time thinking about actually Christian humanitarianism and Muslim humanitarianism. Jewish humanitarianism was just, in terms of the broader, enterprise, just kind of it's a sliver. It's not real big, even though it may be important. And so I began to sort of, puzzle on that, and I, said, well, there's nothing really unusual about this, because we know the fact that the Jewish community has always been involved in a lot of social justice movements. It sort of remembers with pride its role in American civil rights struggles, and in many ways what American Jews are expressing are just like what we see with all other faith-based organizations and faith communities in the United States. So Jews are just like everybody else. Yet what caught my attention, and this may be part of the dreariness of driving carpool with such regularity, was in fact that moment of exchange. The fact that the banner on Israel had come down, and instead now there was this banner in support of mobilization on Darfur. And I began to think, is there symbolism here? I began to look for some kind of mystical reading, that there was something going on that I needed to sort of begin to tease apart. And I began to wonder then about two broad trends, as I sort of generally understood, that were going on in the American Jewish community. One trend was this rise of Jewish humanitarianism, which I'll just call broadly tikkun olam, which had become something of, I don't know if it was become a household term, that may be a little bit dramatic, but it had been on the rise by any measure that you could imagine, in terms of dollars that were committed, the number of organizations that were set up for tikkun olam, the number of alternative spring breaks provided by Hillel. Any number you wanted, it was on the rise. The other trend was this distancing from Israel. Huge debate here about whether American Jews are distancing from Israel, but the general observation is that American Jews are losing their love. Again, huge debate here about how we understand this, but I began to wonder, here are these two big trends, a rise in tikkun olam and a growing distance from Israel. Is there a relationship? Now, part of it is that it could be, and I realized this very quickly, the product of a hyperactive imagination. That there really was no great mystical meaning in this moment. There was no revelation. There is no relationship whatsoever. But I couldn't let that go. That seemed that was too easy. And instead I began to sort of play around with what that relationship might be. And one is that it could be that American Jews are finding their way to Tikkun Olam, and as a consequence, just don't have the time for Israel that they used to. There's only so much space on the outside wall of Temple Israel. There's only so much space, as I looked at the bulletin, for what you can do in terms of programming. American Jews are just simply, it's not that they lost their love for Israel, it's just that they're feeling more passionate these days for Tikkun Olam. And so, let's not make more out of this than it can be. The other possibility, though, is that what if the growing distance from Israel is making Tikkun Olam more attractive? What if there's that growing distancing that's taking place, and American Jews are now beginning to wonder if I can't enact my identity through Israel in the same way, with the same ease, then I need to find somewhere else to go. Going to Israel, for many American Jews, leaves them with mixed feelings. There's the sense of pride, but there's also a sense of disquiet. I attended one workshop in D.C. It was called How to Handle My Dysfunctional Relationship with Israel. These were former birthright veterans. And as one person said, I can't wait to go to Israel, and then I can't wait to leave. And so there was this capturing of this kind of ambivalence that was going on. And it's also the case then that Tikkun Olam doesn't leave Jews or anybody with that same moral ambivalence. You can actually go work in, dig latrines in El Salvador, like I did with the American Jewish World Service, and feel no moral ambivalence whatsoever. Going to Israel, on the other hand, raises all kinds of questions that oftentimes American Jews would just not rather ask. And so maybe it is the case that American Jews are finding their way to Tikkun Olam in part because they are finding it more difficult to act through Israel. That was my broad question. And what's the answer? It's complicated as all these things go. And in many ways, I don't think it's as interesting as my attempt to try to figure out what that relationship might be. So what I'd rather do than and I'll tell you, I do think that there's some connection. I will tell you that a lot of it's speculative. But I do think that if it is happening, I think the story and the reasons will go something like the following. Now, part of it I want to say is I just sort of truth in advertising. I actually don't know much about American Jewish history. I know even less about Judaism. I know a whole lot about international relations. And my approach to the subject was very much informed by my own interrogation with this question of humanitarianism. And the reason why that's important is because one of the central questions that we ask in humanitarianism is, how does a political community come to define its obligations to outsiders? How do you understand what you owe to those who are strangers? This is the basic question for humanitarianism, and one of the fascinating aspects of global humanitarianism is the fact that we've seen over the last 250 years an expansion from your fellow brethren to kindred religious spirit, from family to community to village to city to nation, and now to the global community. And it's been that expansion that has really rather startled many people who study humanitarianism. And in many ways, in the work that I wanted to do for understanding American Jews and the Darfur, I wanted to know, how is it that the American Jewish community comes to define its obligations to those outside the Jewish community? How do we understand this? And so as I began to think about this relationship between, in this case, Darfur and Israel in more complicated ways, I began to realize that, in fact, what was maybe taking place was what seemed to be this ongoing struggle between the universal and the particular. It was my obligations to fellow Jews, but also obligations to distant strangers. And how do we actually wrestle with that? How do we make sense of this relationship? And I want to say, again, as you know, most of my questions here are not sort of normative or theological. I can't answer what they should be. What I'm interested in is what people think how they should be at that particular historical moment. So I want to know, and this is what the book is about, is how do American Jews deal with, in different ways and in different times, that relationship between the universal and the particular, or what I will also call between the cosmopolitan and the tribal. Okay? So that's kind of what the book is about. And the way I approached it were three layers. And the first was the one I'm least qualified to comment on was the religious aspect, which is Judaism. I had actually spent a little bit of time going through Torah training with a fabulous rabbi. And as he enlightened me, he told me that this question of and one way to read the Torah is this ongoing struggle between the universal and the particular. That's an ongoing theme in fact, Jewish history, and it's captured oftentimes by these great sayings like, "Are we a people apart or a people that dwells alone?" There's also the prophetic side, which has various kinds of expressions from Isaiah and others that are more famous than it, that drape the walls of the United Nations, which is they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and they should be a light unto nations. These are other images that are very much present in text. But as I say, I'm not really qualified to lead a Torah study on how it is that Judaism works through this. I'm actually more interested in how it is that a real live political community, in this case Jews, wrestle with these questions. And so this leads to my second layer, which is thinking about Jews as a transnational people. Now, part of the reason why I think this is actually interesting is I've actually never really thought about the Jews as a transnational people, as a transnational community. And in fact, one of the interesting things that began to happen in the 19th century for the Jewish community, mainly in Europe, but it wasn't just the Jewish community, it was something that was sweeping all of Europe, were new forms of internationalism. There were new developments of sense of transnational solidarity. Some of it was class, about labor solidarity. Some of it was about religious solidarity. But one of the things you began to see in Europe around in the mid-19th century were new forms of Jewish internationalism, where Jews began to essentially organize transnationally between Berlin and Paris and London, and begin to sort of wonder about their common fate, about how they should actually pursue their collective interests. And there were two basic issues, I should say, that sort of dominated, if you will, that Jewish agenda at this time. One was the Jewish problem. Now, this is essentially, how do you keep non-Jews from beating the heck out of Jews? That's basically the Jewish problem. And it's not really a Jewish problem. It's the problem that Gentiles have with the Jews. And so a big reason for these new forms of internationalism was that these were Jewish defense societies. They were organizations that are beginning to think about how to band together so that when there's a ritual murder that takes place in Damascus, how should Jews respond? When there's a kidnapping in Italy, how should Jews respond? And so it is then this basic question that as a minority people in exile that live at the mercy of a majority population who barely treat them well and often as a punching bag, how is it that you organize transnationally to begin to actually exert those common interests? That's the first big puzzle. The other one wasn't done internationally. It was done more quietly, oftentimes domestically, which was what was called the Jewish question. And that essentially was how should Jews exist in the world? Again, raising these questions about the universal and the particular, but these questions are now being raised in a very different historical context in Europe, and that's with the rise of the nation state. One of the things that begins to happen in the 19th century is the emergence of a national state. And one of the dimensions of that rise of nationalism is that the citizens, the new citizens of these communities, now are expected to actually pledge their loyalties to the state. Well, for a transnational people, that's actually kind of difficult. How do you think about that tension between your loyalty to the state versus your traditional loyalties to the Jews of Vilna? I mean, how does one think about this? And increasingly, as I understand it, I think about this now from again with my hat in international relations, it was how do a stateless people with a deep collective identity accommodate themselves to a world increasingly organized around the nation state? What do you do? And part of that answer is going to be dependent on what it is that the nation state in which they're housed, what they do. So different Jewish communities, and what I'm saying here I think is actually standard fare in certainly the academic literature, is that different Jewish communities in Europe and Eastern Europe and Russia answer these questions in different ways. In some communities, what you had was Jews who basically began to organize themselves in ways that say, we can be a member of the nation state. In other places, it wasn't so easy. And the explanation for this comes from a Jewish intellectual from the 19th century who basically said, if you want to understand the Jews, you got to begin with the Gentiles. And how that translates is that how it is that the Jews respond depends on how the Gentiles treat them. And where the Gentiles offered an invitation to Jewish communities at home to integrate, to become part of society, to become part of the fabric of community, that's where you found Jewish communities be most receptive to ideologies of integration. In France, it was ideologies of republicanism. In other places, it was liberalism. But there was a sense then that opportunities were opening up, and the problem for Jews now was to fit in, to show that they could be just like everybody else. In other places, however, where there was a folk nationalism or ethnic nationalism, often in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Jews were defined as outside the nation state. And so for them, there was no way of integrating. And this is actually where then you begin to see other forms of political responses, primarily in the form of socialism. The problem is the nation state, and so we need to think about new forms of transnational solidarity that have to do with economic cooperation, and this little minor movement called Zionism, which becomes part of the response. If you can't join them, then leave. And so what you began to see then in the context of Europe was this kind of interesting division taking place among Jews about how to balance the universal and the particular, how to think about the relationship between the nation and the broader cosmopolitan international moment that's arriving. Where do the American Jews fit in? Well, Emma Lazarus, who, as you all know, her saying adorns the Statue of Liberty, had a different saying that didn't quite make it. I guess it was second, which is that the truth is that every Jew has to crack for himself this nut in his particular position in a non-Jewish country. In other words, there is no formula, there's no recipe for how Jews are going to deal with how to fit in or not. They're going to have to find their own way. And the United States, it'd be fair to say, we're just like American Jews, were just like all other Jews in that they were wrestling with these questions, but they're wrestling with them in a very different political context. They're wrestling with them in the United States that, in fact, this can be hyped, and I know that there are huge debates within Jewish historiography on this, the extent to which America really was truly different from all other countries in terms of its treatment of the Jews. But one adage that I think stands reasonably well is that America was different because it did not treat its Jews as different. There was an immediate possibility of some form of integration. So as they're coming, they don't have to worry about tearing down ghetto walls because the walls don't exist. And so they find it much easier to integrate, and they begin to develop a strategy of survival that's about integration and accommodation. And they begin to actually rail against ideologies that preach separation and tribalism. Increasingly, then, the American Jewish identity begins to form in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it forms around two key elements. One is liberalism, and this is not the liberalism of Hillary Clinton. This is the liberalism, the sort of standard, more political theory liberalism that is about equality. It is about the separation of church and state. It is about judging people on their merits and what they do, and not on the basis of their skin or their religion. It is about a kind of fairness that's supposed to exist in the civic body politic. And what you began to see then was that Jews clung to this ideology, and it wasn't simply only, it wasn't until Roosevelt's election in 1932 that Jews become really identified with the Democratic Party. But in fact, the American Jewish establishment, such as it was at the turn of the 20th century, was actually, in terms of some organizations, evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. And in fact, Republicans probably had the edge. Why? Because Republicans were the party of Lincoln. This was the party that actually seemed to really understand how it is that you treat everyone as equal. And so you begin to have liberalism as a defining quality, and it never goes away. As Milton Himmelfarb, a very well-known neoconservative, said, it's a great quote, "Jews vote like Puerto Ricans but earn like Episcopalians," which is that, if the Jews were going to vote their pocketbook, they should be Republicans. There's no question about it. But for some reason, they're just stuck in this leftist progressive ideology. And so, this is kind of an anomaly for at least those of us who think that economic wealth in some ways correlates with party identification. The other big development that takes place in the United States, and I use this term broadly, is the rise of non-Orthodox Judaism. You begin to have the Reform movement, and then, a few decades later, the emergence of a conservative movement. And by and large, though, what begins to develop in the United States is where non-Orthodox Judaism, which is basically anything that's not Orthodox, begins to become very anchored in American Jewish life and becomes dominant within American Jewish community organizations. These two aspects, the liberalism and the movement towards non-Orthodox Judaism, which is captured by, in many ways, the Reform movement, combines to create something that I think is, I just simply call, because as an academic, you've got to label things in new and novel ways as a way to get attention. So this is actually my way. And this is a political theology of prophetic Judaism. That if you look at the variety of ways in which Judaism exists, how it's lived, breathed, and practices, there are a myriad possibilities. There's no single Judaism. But in fact, you could argue from a selection process that American Jews selected a form of Judaism that actually was relatively suitable for their American circumstance. It allowed them to fit in. It would allow them to present a sense of, we're just like you. So this, and begin to emphasize in many ways that they are Jewish, but not too Jewish. They imagine themselves as part of a broader community and not apart from it. They emphasize not rituals, but ethics. And they see themselves as a model for a better world. They're not chosen. They just need to own up to their responsibilities. Now, this kind of political culture of American Jews is something that is studied by political scientists, and this actually in many ways, and when they talk about the American political culture, it helps to explain why American Jews seem to have been, again, sort of Milton Himmelfarb is, in terms of why they keep acting like Puerto Ricans when they should be Episcopalians. There is that sense that American Jews keep acting left, and the reason why is because of this broader sense of American Jewish identity, and it shapes their general orientation in politics. At least since Roosevelt, they tend to be more oriented towards they're more democratic in terms of their party ID. They tend to be more in favor of progressive politics. They were in favor of civil rights, and then initially busing. Then it was a little complicated, and then there were other things as well in terms of environmentalism. But basically, what you find is that American Jews tend to be associated with various forms of progressive politics that often also try to keep the state out of any severe involvement in personal life, which is also why they've been on the forefront of making sure that there's a separation of church and state. I don't think there's anything novel about what I've just said. The part of the book that I think is novel is that what I want to argue then is that this kind of political theology, this adherence to prophetic Judaism, not only has an impact on American Jewish domestic political beliefs, but also on how they see the world. So what do we see? We see a couple of things that are really, I think, are very important. The first aspect of that sort of American Jewish belief in terms of world affairs is something that we can just simply call an embrace of liberal internationalism. Now, liberal internationalism has a particular meaning in the contemporary terms, but essentially what it is, if you look at it, it seems to be an externalization of that American way of life. It promotes democracy and markets and separation of church and state and religious liberty abroad. What you find is that many of the same movements that were involved in the struggle for civil rights were also exactly the same ones that helped to craft the first international human rights treaties. They were the ones who actually helped to form international law. They were the ones that joined with others in trying to, bring into being international institutions like the United Nations. And so what you find oftentimes then is that Jews took this prophetic spirit and wanted to globalize it. In some cases, they were just simply taking their American Jewish identity and wanting it to be part and be integrated into the world at large. And so what we find is a history that's oftentimes, I think, certainly underexplored, but I would say underappreciated, in which American Jews can take credit for helping to form the minority rights treaties at the League of Nations. They can take credit for making sure that human rights became a part of the United Nations system. These are big victories by a very small sliver of a people. And American Jews were proud of that history. In addition to an embrace of liberal internationalism, there is a wariness of nationalism. They're wary of the nationalism of others. Nationalism hasn't been too good to the Jews. Tendency when nationalism begins to sort of heat up, Jews begin to duck for cover. And so they've always been, that's partly why they've been on the fight for ideologies of inclusion. But there's also a wariness of their own nationalism. Remember, what American Jews wanted were ideologies that signaled to the Americans that they could integrate just like everybody else, and that they were just like everybody else. As a consequence, there wasn't a great love for ideologies that highlighted their clannishness, their cliquishness, clubbiness. The worry was that it would play into various kinds of anti-Semitic tropes, that the Jewish problem is not a problem that Gentiles have with the Jews, but that Jews just have a hard time fitting in, and that things like Jewish nationalism, and especially Zionism early on, to the extent that it said the Jews are a separate people who should be in a separate country, that was music to the ears of anti-Semites. And so what you saw was that the American Jewish establishment, and again, this is all pretty, I think, standard stuff in terms of the history of American Jews, is that they began to treat the emergence of Zionism, and this is a century ago, Zionism, as a form of anti-Semitism. They began to worry that the more that Jews fell in love with the idea of Jewish nationalism, the more it would signal to Americans that they really don't fit in. Slowly, we see that American Jews began to find ways, and we can talk about this, find ways to become, as Louis Brandeis famously put it, become hyphenated Americans, when they could begin to integrate their Jewishness and their Americanness. But it was not an easy road. And part of the argument of the book is that the American Jews actually took a long time to get behind the idea of a Jewish territorial state. It took a lot to budge them off this concern about Jews and territory in Palestine. And the love affair that American Jews are rumored to have had with Israel is actually a lot more recent than people think. American Jews were certainly supportive of Israel after 1948, but there was no love affair. There's no data to support it. These were armchair Zionists. There wasn't a great deal of identification with Israel. There's no great, relishing of the new Jewish state. And it's only after 1967 that you begin to find Israel and Zionism become embedded in the core aspects of American Jewish identity. This is a post-67 development. And what's happening, I think, and this is my speculation, and it returns me back to Temple Israel, I think what's happened over the last 20 years is that American Jews are returning to their familiar position of ambivalence. There's lots of things that are going on, and it's a complicated story about why American Jews might be becoming more ambivalent or distancing themselves from Israel. And it has to do with a whole bunch of things like intermarriage and globalization and multiculturalism and wealth, and sort of generational issues, how many years since 67 war and the Holocaust. These all play a role. My question, though, is, and going back to that apocryphal moment for me at Temple Israel, was what role does Israel play? Is Israel contributing to this? And we see in the press all the time that, the speculation that Netanyahu's doing this and that and the other, but this actually predates Netanyahu. And these developments that I'm talking about are actually bigger than Netanyahu. And what is it that's going on? Well, in many ways, I think what's happening is that American Jews are in many ways reevaluating what Israel is. And what they're finding is that Israel's values don't match up with their own. American Jews have always wanted an Israel that would reflect well on them, which basically meant they wanted an Israel that looked like the Midwest. And guess what? That's not what they got. What they got was an Israel that's organized in ways that sort of is trending increasingly away from the values that American Jews define as core. What are they? We see from public opinion, and again, some of this is, you can go back and look at the Pew survey and then from 2015 of Israel Jews and American Jews, and you begin to see some of these differences. Israeli Jews tend to be much less liberal. They're much more willing to do these trade-offs in terms of democracy if it preserves a Jewish state. You see polls of American Jews, and for them, it is absolutely crucial that Israel remains a democracy. Not so in Israel. It's more theocratic in the sense that religion is bound up with the very state of Israel in ways that American Jews would find very problematic if, in fact, it was Christianity in the United States. And Israel is a Jewish state. That means it's an ethnically nationalist state. This is not civic nationalism. And while Israeli Arabs have comparable political and civil rights, there's no question that this is a two-tiered system. It's a Jewish state. That's what it's about. That's what Israel's fighting to maintain, a Jewish state. Well, that means that if you're not Jewish and you're in this state, you're on the outside looking in. So what really matters is not whether Israel is these things, because again, this is debatable. What matters is that American Jews are reassessing whether Israel is in fact lining up with their values. And I think what the evidence suggests is that they're finding that Israel comes up short, and they're becoming increasingly ambivalent. And my sense then, when looking at the story, is that what's taking place, which I think in the popular press is being dramatized as this sort of inaugural moment in which American Jews are really sort of debating about Jewish nationalism in Israel, this is not the first time. I can tell you stories about what took place 100 years ago. And it was much more severe and played out much more in public. So I think what I saw at that day in Temple Israel was this kind of moment in which American Jews are once again struggling with that relationship between particularism and universalism, are trying to figure out how best not to reconcile, but in some sense manage that relationship. And that relationship now is being sort of unwound by the debates about Israel. Let me conclude there, and I'm told I'm going to field my questions, Ron.
So, I was about to say that Professor Barnett has graciously agreed to answer some questions, and he'll field his own for about the next 10
I won't be gracious about it, but that's...
next 10 or 15 minutes. So, please.
Yeah.
It seems that the United States, the whole country, has taken on this international, quote, liberal, as you define it, perspective. I'd like you to comment on how that influence, as opposed to internal Jewish influence, has led to this change.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, there's this debate about sort of, and it's going on right now, right? And it always goes on every election cycle about what posture the United States should have towards the world. Should it be more internationalist or should it be more isolationist? And in a media hype world where we have to always present candidates in binary terms, Clinton is the internationalist and Trump is the isolationist. And there's always been both strands within American political culture in terms of its attitudes. What we see, though, is that Americans, by and large, are more divided along, and there's more of a struggle between the internationalists and the nationalists. What we see about American Jews is that they've been much more they're more inclined, well, historically, not now, about human rights than Americans broadly, much more inclined to support the United Nations and international law more broadly. They're much more reluctant to resolve disputes through the use of force, and on and on and on and on. So American Jews are in some ways don't actually have the same kind of, have not historically had the same kind of tensions that America broadly has about sort of that balance between internationalism and isolationism.
This kind of plays out in Jewish organizational life. I mean, there are organizations that are prominent today. They're quite particularistic. The Israel Project, Stand With Us, Zionist Organization of America, and those that are more universalistic, like Jewish Community Relations Council, the Jewish Labor Committee. They're more in the twilight. Except if you look at the younger demographics, that we have groups like Ben the Ark and a Jewish Voice for Peace, and you see a lot of Jews in their 20s and 30s. J Street. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are two parts to the question. One is sort of how does what I say map onto what is called the American Jewish establishment or American Jewish life, and I think when it comes to, I think part of the story that's interesting, and I think there's been Peter Beinart's written a fair bit about this. I'm not in complete agreement with his analysis, quite frankly, but it's one that's sort of most identified and out there, is where, as he argues, there's this big disconnect between where he thinks the American Jews are and then where you find the American Jewish establishment. And so there's this friction, and he thinks that the American Jewish establishment, I mean, they're Neanderthals, and the sort of, I mean, I think that's the way he characterizes it, and American Jews more broadly are a little more enlightened. I think one of the interesting developments is the extent to which there has been a capturing of in terms of a more particularistic spirit within American Jewish association life in the top levels, so that in the Conference of Presidential, and so forth. And and so in that way, it's not. I mean, I do agree with Beinart. It doesn't necessarily represent the tenor of where American Jews are. But I should just simply say, in fairness, that 100 years ago, the American Jewish establishment was anti-Zionist. And one of the big clashes was in the 1920s when you began to have a new generation of American Jews asking for the democratization of American Jewish associational life and wanting to bring those two into correspondence. So there's always been something of a disconnect, and that's an internal party struggle. The other is the generational. And what we're seeing is that, and in this sense, it tracks reasonably well with what we see with this generation, with millennials, for instance, overall, in terms of their variety of characteristics. But some of them are actually more important for understanding the story. I think one is this is a group that is relatively well off. They're reasonably well traveled. They tend to be more universalistic. They tend to have an easier time with multiculturalism and other kinds of issues. It's just something that has been part of their way of life. There is growing intermarriage, which also does play certainly a role in all this. Some of the other factors, though, that are more specific to what people are marking in terms of this kind of more progressive or universalistic is that they are finding Israel wanting. I think it's more pronounced in that group than we find more generally with the American Jewish population. And there is that fact that this is a generation that's very distant from the Holocaust and from the 1967 war, which have been the two key events that have defined certainly American Jews of the previous generation. And for them, it doesn't resonate. And part of the reason it doesn't resonate is because, honestly, despite sometimes what you read in the Jewish press, they don't have a lot of experiences with anti-Semitism. That's not what they've experienced. And if it does exist, it's more hurtful than anything else. And so conversations that really are about remember the Holocaust or never again, or remember 67 when Israel was almost wiped off, it's, they're more, my children are more removed from those years than I was. I was born in 1960. That was, and the Holocaust ended, right, 15 years before. For me, that's history. These are now kids that have been sort of born in a fundamentally different, and have been raised in a different milieu. And so they have a different set of attitudes. Their experiences are not the experiences of their grandparents or even their parents. And that makes a huge difference in terms of their orientation to the world. Yeah.
So I might be missing something here, maybe you could enlighten me. Say your story about Temple Israel, where they took down the sign that showed our support for Israel and put up the sign for Darfur. Why can't you have both signs up? Why can't you care about your Judaism, care about your state of Israel, and still be concerned with Darfur? I think that it's when someone knows more strongly what his roots are, they can go out into the world and help others without being totally confused.
Yeah, no, and that's certainly, and as I say, that's, and that's why I'm, at the very open I said there could be no relationship whatsoever, or in many ways you could actually think of a harmonious relationship, and this is actually the Brandeis line from his campaigns for the Zionist leadership about actually 100 years ago, maybe today, I don't know, was that basically by being a better American you will be a better Zionist, and by being a better Zionist you will be a better American. That was the great moment in which you were going to merge these two things together. And in many ways, I think what you do find are various organizations that actually actively try to promote the relationship between the two. And so, that was one of the reasons why I went on this trip to El Salvador with the American Jewish World Service. Because that's an organization that makes it very clear that they want to actually be Jews, and by being Jews, you're part of the world, and by being part of the world, you will come back as better Jews. That's their line. I think one of the things, and this is actually where it's an interesting and nuanced story about the difficulty of doing that. So I'll just take a couple examples. Darfur was interesting because one of the things that the American Jewish community had to avoid in that case was accusations that they were actually mobilizing on Darfur because it was about Muslims, and therefore there was bias in there, and they were trying to take away pressure on Israel. I actually don't think that was part of the mobilization strategy or the reasons, but the accusations were out there. More interesting in many ways are a whole set of issues that have become difficult for American Jews actually to talk about in public that they used to talk about quite easily. So, for instance, I came across all this fascinating, some internal memos in some American Jewish organizations that were about Guantanamo. And their instinct was this was a bad thing, that American Jews largely line up on human rights and they're not in favor of torture. That's not good. But the problem, though, was that they basically said, we can't talk about this. Why? Because if we talk about torture, we're going to have to talk about Israel. We can't actually come out we can't come out with a strong stand that says the U.S. government should not be torturing enemy combatants, because if they do, the first thing that we're going to get asked, so the document said, is, so what about Israel? And that there's a whole host of things that American Jews would probably like to talk about, but the consequence of Israel being there is a degree of self-censoring. And so I think that actually has had an impact of narrowing the conversation about how American Jews engage the world. So I think, in principle, yes. I think in practice, it's actually sometimes a little more complicated. Yeah.
A couple things. Thank you very much for coming and talking with us. Tikkun Olam for me has been kind of a centerpiece to my life, politically and professionally, for a long time. It seems to kind of sum up why I do anything. But I've also thought about it as in a sense, in our self-interest, directly. Because as Jews think about their vulnerability to dark forces, obviously we can't survive only on our own. So
Right.
when Jews engage with black community, with other communities, we're not only doing some good, but we're doing something that makes sense. And I don't know how much of a factor that is with people in Tikkun Olam. I just wanted to ask one other thing. Your particular and universal course sounds dialectical. It's much the way Jews think.
It's complicated. That's the way Jews think. Yeah.
It's all around. It's all around. But of course, the political version of that has often been related to revolutionary politics, Marxism, the left, a lot of Jews on the left. And the contradiction is there are a lot of Jews that are very strong capitalists and are blamed for the worst excesses of capitalism. On the other hand, they're blamed because they're revolutionaries. They're trying to overthrow capitalism. And
They can't win.
yeah. So we're caught in it. I'm just wondering if that's come up in a sense as Jews try to figure out, well, how do we think of ourselves? Are we radical? Are we...
Yeah, there's, part of it is how do Jews think of themselves, and as I've already said, part of it has to do with the historical moment in which they're, in which they exist. So, if you were born in Poland in the 19th century, you were maybe more likely to sort of go towards the Bundist or various kinds of Marxist politics than sort of liberal politics. I mean, there was some of that, but it was in danger as well. So I think part of it is that there's this sort of, as you point out, there are a variety, if you will. There's a menu of choice out there. In terms of how is it that you want to enact, as Jews, how do you want to enact and act in the world? And, part of it has to do with then sort of what world do you want and what world do you see? And certainly for those who were engaged in, let's say, revolutionary, the anarchists or the socialists, for them, part of the enemy was nationalism and religion. I mean, for them, the ultimate goal was actually to find all of us melting into a common humanity. But in fact, for many Jews, that's not the goal. The goal is to find a way in which you can actually maintain a Jewish identity while also being part of the world. And that's always a difficult, thing to submit. The first observation I think is real. I think it's a critical point, and it's really interesting in terms of the relationship between Tikkun Olam and self-interest. And it's not, this is not unusual. A lot of faith-based groups have exactly the same kind of orientation, and especially if you're a minority people. If you're a minority people, the strategy is to show that actually you know what it means to be part of the body politic and be a responsible citizen. It also can be part of a coalition building strategy, that alone we're weak, but we need to work across other minority groups. That was the dominant strategy, as I understand, in a lot of American Jewish politics until the 1960s. And then the 67 war happened, and at least the lore is that American Jews were looking for their, partners in the minorities, and they were nowhere to be found. And one of the striking things for American Jews was that they weren't being found with other minorities. It was over in the Republican Party that actually were welcoming Jews and showing we're really pro-Israel. And so it actually created, I think, some tensions. But I do hear, and this is where I'll just bring it back to those tensions between Israel and Tikkun Olam in many ways, and the kinds of motivations that I see. And part of this, I'll just be very, truthful. These are anecdotes. These are conversations I've had with people when I interview them in a lot of Tikkun Olam organizations, the ones that are doing, a lot of the for international work. I've had some tell me, for instance, that the reason why they do Tikkun Olam is because they want Americans to think better of Jews. And that's actually an ongoing strategy. That's part of the reason why I think American Jews have always been involved in social justice movements at home, philanthropy, soup kitchens, things like that. The other, though, that's directly connected to Israel is I've had some tell me that in this day and age, The problem for Jews, not American Jews, for Jews, is that Israel is now the representative of the Jewish people. And it's not giving off a good impression. That the image of the Jew worldwide now is quite literally, it's an occupier. And what we need to do, and I've seen the internal documents, and I've talked to people about this, what we need to do is to present a different face of the Jewish people. Because of Israel. That Israel, in this case, is a threat to our survival. And so we need to work doubly hard to present, and in many ways, I'll just say, I was doing a lot of work on faith-based humanitarianism, before I did this project, and I ended up spending a little bit of time with Islamic Relief, which is the largest Western Muslim organization, and interviewed one of the high-ranking people, and I asked him, so why, he'd been with Save the Children before, and a lot of the folks who were in this Islamic organization had been with other kinds of secular organizations. So why are you with Islamic Relief now? And he said, you know why I joined? Because I want to show my children and everybody else in Britain that Muslims can be more than terrorists. And that conversation stuck with me. I was interviewing people in the various kinds of Tikkun Olam organizations. Is that for them, it wasn't necessarily that they think that Israel is those things. It's that they're hyper aware that Israel is creating an image out there that isn't necessarily, let's just say, comfortable for them back at home. And so, one of the lines in the book is that American Jews and American Muslims have something in common, which is that they've got to deal with their relatives in the Middle East that are giving them a bad name. In some ways that's, again, it's possible to take these little bit of conversations and, go too far with them. But I think it actually reflects some of these kinds of private concerns and, additional reasons why we find that Tikkun Olam, more reasons why Tikkun Olam becomes something that American Jews want to do.